thing, but you actually mean the opposite. That came from Orwell's book and so forth. Well, Orwell had this vision of a society, we think of it more or less as the communist society, in which people are kept from reading. Nobody's allowed to read a book. Nobody's allowed.
By the way, that's pretty much exactly what is happening, and it's hard for people to digest it. But basically speaking, you're looking at communism arriving in its full force here in our land.
To think, because the state is forcing them to do what the state wants it to do. Well, he says in the preface, we forget that about the same time that Orwell wrote 1984, there was another futuristic, negative utopia novel by Aldous Huxley, and his book was called Brave New World. And it pictured a world in which nobody read any books, but the reason was quite different. It's not because they weren't allowed to read any books, it's because nobody wanted to read any books. You see, in this world, everybody's taken care of. Everybody is happy. Everybody is entertained. They have something like television, watching them all the time, and that they're watching it all the time. They have a drug.
Or they had cell phones. Everybody's under the drug of a cell phone.
That they kind of take that makes them feel good. When they watch television, they sort of have a little thing they hang on to with their hands. It's called the feelies that make them actually feel what's going on, and everybody's just sort of lulled into nothing. And what Postman says in the beginning is, look, we look at the former communist states and we say, oh yeah, there's that big bad negative utopia. Orwell really had it right for them, and he forgets that the Western world has fallen into the pattern of the negative utopia described by Aldous Huxley, you see. And then he goes in to talk about how it happens. He makes a point of contrasting two kinds of communication. He says there was an age when communication was dominated by topography. That refers to writing, type. And he said, you know, in that age where people communicated by words, they read magazine articles, newspapers, and began to think according to the kind of laws that you have when you write something down, people really could think. And they really didn't know what was going on. But he says the age of typography has been supplanted now by the age of television, where we're not communicating chiefly in words, though of course we do have that at the same time, but we're communicating chiefly by images on a screen, and that is not an age that is inducive to thinking.
So let's add a little further to that, not just television, but the computers and cell phones. So topography, or acquiring your information from reading, is almost gone. And I have to admit, in my own life, I do not read as much as I used to read. And if you're listening to this, make a decision to at least balance your life to do some reading, because that keeps you well grounded. It keeps you in terms of having logical thinking rather than just absorbing everything through visual media.
Now let me just illustrate it a little bit. Think back, I know you can remember back 100 years or so, to the famous debates, political debates between Abraham Lincoln and Douglas. Now, they were fake.
Okay, now once again, let me intervene here and say, like Dr. Boyce, I believed Abraham Lincoln was a genuine individual, and everything said about him was true. But that's false. Abraham Lincoln was an actor who also played Jefferson Davis and John Brown. So he was part of hoax history. So I'm trying to do some disclaimers in this lengthy little lecture commentary so that you know I'm aware that we've been hoaxed even by our most sacred, heroic characters like Abraham Lincoln. Hoax.
That was sort of a high water mark in the politics of America. These two men would get out in the fairground out in Illinois or somewhere, and they'd have thousands of people there for the fair, and there'd be a little platform like this, and they'd have it all set up, and Lincoln and Douglas would debate the political issues of the day. They would debate the political issues of the day for 6 or 7 hours. And people would gather around and listen to them for 6 or 7 hours. People really knew what was going on. Furthermore, what they debated was picked up by the reporters, and by means of the telegraph, it was communicated all over America, and it appeared the next day in the newspapers, and people read the newspapers, and they really did know where Abraham Lincoln stood, and where Douglas stood, and where the other political figures of the day stood. So when they went to the polls to vote, they were voting intelligently. They knew what they were talking about. Now, you see, what Postman says is words do that. You know, when you read an article, you think about it, if you can still think. And what you do is you understand what that person is trying to say and try to get into it. If you don't agree with it, you say, I don't agree with that. And why don't I agree with that? And you think it over. You say, well, because he's leaving out this. And you begin to produce arguments that are to the contrary. And it helps to stimulate your thought and firm up your own opinions. But you don't have that on television. Television doesn't give you information. It presents pictures. And furthermore, it doesn't give you time to think about it, even if it did present information, because it changes quickly from one thing to the other. Let me illustrate a little bit how it works. Take news on television. That's where we would start, because we think, whatever the entertainment on television might be, at least we have the news programs. We get all this great news from the networks, so we really know what's going on. Do you know that the average news segment on network television, not the local television, our local television in Philadelphia is a joke, but on network news out of New York, the big networks, the average news segment is 45 seconds. Now, how much news do you think you can get in 45 seconds? Plus, not only do you only have your 45 seconds, maybe you could say something significant in 45 seconds if you had time to think about it, but of course immediately it changes to something else, and so immediately what you're just seeing is out of your head. You don't really get time to reflect on it. Sometimes it's tragic. I remember I was at Memphis a number of years ago. We were doing one of our Reformed theology conferences there, and somebody in Memphis thought, well, they had connections with a TV station. They could get us on to do an interview, and so they set up an interview for me on the Friday before the conference started, and I had come in the night before, so I went down to the station. It was Channel 6, as I recall, and they have this TV news show at 12 o'clock, noon. They wouldn't have put this on at night, I think, but they did it at noontime. And I was supposed to have a 2-minute interview. Well, I'm sitting there in the studio waiting for my 2-minute segment, and I'm listening to them do the news. And they're reading it off the teleprompter, of course. And here they're reading the first news story and the second news story. And then all of a sudden, right in the middle of it, there is a beep, 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 beep. That's the clue that you've got a fast-breaking news story. Right, something had just come in over the wire, picks you up. You've got to listen to this sort of thing. Well, it was all on the teleprompter. It's a staged thing, It might have been fast-breaking, but it wasn't fast-breaking enough that they couldn't get it. Actually, they weren't ad-libbing this. It was on the teleprompter, so this thing comes on, and I'm watching this, and what it was is a storm that had struck some of the islands of Japan, and there had been a lot of destruction. It was a typhoon. A lot of people were dead, and cities were flooded and that sort of thing. Now, what you should have done if you were responding to that in a human way is stop and think in terms of the victims of the tragedy. It should evoke some kind of...
Yes, they're a death cult, the ones who run the system. And they love death, whether it's real, R-E-A-L, or R-E-E-L. It doesn't matter. And what Dr. Boyce is saying is that the average individual, if what they're saying is true, should probably burst into tears and weep. But that won't be the case, because they'll go on to the next thing rather quickly. Now, once again, the system is based on hoaxing and lying, which means that the stories you hear of great disasters are not exactly what you think. And I did a whole series of videos on the Johnstown flood of 1889. You can check out those videos where I will show you The entire disaster was just disaster hoaxing.
Compassion in your heart. I mean, it might be half a world away, and there might be nothing that you can do about it, but here are people that are dying, or dead, you see. But that isn't what happened. This thing went on for about 30 seconds, about the right length for a fast-breaking, important news story. And then this announcer said, "Now this." Well, that rang a bell with me because Postman's chapter on TV news is called "Now This." He says, those are the words you hear most often on network news, and you know exactly what it means. It's a conjunction. It's linking up this little segment with the segment that is to come, but it doesn't operate the way a conjunction operates. A conjunction links. That's the meaning of the word conjunction. This is actually a conjunction that separates. And what it means is what you're about to see has no relationship whatsoever to what you have just seen. Furthermore, it probably doesn't have any relationship to anything.
So when you hear that little term, "now this," it's a lot like being in a standard shift car and they're saying we're shifting gears. We're out of first gear, now we're going into second gear, now we're going into third gear. Get rid of first gear, you're done with it. You had your 15, you had your 40 seconds, your 45 seconds for that story. Now it's time for another 45 seconds. And that's how the news broadcasts are composed, of all these "now this," shifting of gears.
And so he said, "Now this," and you know what happened? They switched to their version of the Galloping Gourmet. It was the local one there in Memphis, and it was taped in advance. So the guy wasn't doing this in the studio, so they went to this little taped segment. And what was this man teaching you how to make? Teriyaki. It was ludicrous. You see, here we've got a real-life tragedy. Now this, we switch over to the other thing. We forget all about it because what we want to do is prepare a Japanese dish. Now,
okay, once again, he said a real-life tragedy. You know, Dr. Boyce would have believed it was real, R-E-A-L. And I would have too, before I was taken out of the system. So my heart goes out to people, and those people that truly believe all this stuff. I was one of them. I'd like to proclaim that very loudly and very clearly. But he's getting at the whole idea of how insane the news is. No matter what you think about the news, it's insane. You go from a death story to making food.
you see what Postman is saying, if we're operating that way, we're given the impression that we know what's going on, but we don't know what's going on, and even if we did, we don't have any time to really think about it like human beings. What if the announcer thought about it like a human being? You know, there are a lot of tragedies on television. I sort of got into the habit in Philadelphia, when I see the news at night, which is not every night, but when I do, I count the number of murders that are the news stories. How many different murders are there? They're talking about that night? It's 5 or 6, you know, normally at a time. Not 5 or 6 people necessarily killed every day. You know, some.
And most likely there were none. Most likely. Because they're in on it. The police, the news media, fake stories over and over and over again to scare the living daylights out of you and me and your children and grandchildren. They're fearmongers. Now, Dr. Boyce didn't know this. I didn't know all this. And I believe the date of this lecture that he delivered was about 1993.
Spill over from the day before and so forth. But there are people dying, you know, and then they love the pictures of the body bags being brought out, and if they can get weeping people on the screen, you know, that's just great for television. What would you think of an announcer that was actually touched by that like a human being should be? You know, there's a mother that's lost a 3-year-old child. Random.
Okay, not just the people that are listening to it, and not even the broadcasters, but how about the individuals that are standing in front of a camera telling you about the death of their daughter or their son? You should see them in absolute hysterical tears, beyond question. But no, they stand there real calmly and tell you about the death of their son or daughter or family. You know why? Because they're actors. They're liars. I've been around people that have lost loved ones in tragedies, and I'm going to tell you something. They don't stand there composed. In fact, many of them can't speak. And they can't speak for a long time about it because it goes deep into their soul. So you see someone on TV telling you about how sad they are and they touch their eyes. They're liars. Now, Dr. Boyce didn't know all this, and I didn't either. So I'm only using this as a means of talking to you and hopefully allowing you to get some good information, as Dr. Boyce is very knowledgeable, and his presentation I thought was very outstanding, and I wanted to share it with you.
Drive-by shooting in the drug area of the city. And this woman's crying. What if the announcer recognized the tragedy in that family, that this lawlessness in our society is snatching away 3 years old, and he would begin to cry. Well, an announcer like that wouldn't make it on television. You get rid of him. You can't do that. Because they're there to sell goods, you see. And the whole objective of television news is to make it interesting, keep it moving quickly, go from a commercial to a news story to the weather and so forth. So you'll watch our channel rather than somebody else's channel, and we can charge more for our commercials than they can.
So remember, the Bible tells us the love of money is the root of all evil. That is what drives the system. The love of the money. And it doesn't matter to these hoaxers and these liars because they get paid extremely well to hoax and lie you through the system, to lie to you through the system. So I think I'm going to stop this, and I realize this has been a lengthy video. It's not a visual video in that I don't have a lot of visuals in front of you except Dr. Boyce talking. But if you got to the end of it, I'd like to commend you because it means you're able to let go of the visuals and you can learn just simply through auditory, through hearing. And remember what the Bible says. How does faith come? Faith comes through hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Thank you for watching this video. End of video.